April 3, 2006 Observer Newsletter. Death of Ann Calvello. Famous historical issue, history of roller derby and its biggest stars, plus all the wrestling and MMA news leading into WrestleMania. By Observer staff. Wrestling Observer Newsletter, P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 950091228. ISSN 10,839,593. April 3, 2006. With the biggest event of the year just days away, there seems to be far more interest in what is going on behind the scenes at WrestleMania weekend than on the show itself. WrestleMania itself is going to end up telling an interesting story. We are going to find out what the name plus the greatest advertising blitz in company history, particularly in the UK, means for a show that really doesn't have that one or more matches with killer interest. The biggest promotional push has been put behind the Vince McMahon vs. Shawn Michaels match. But no matter what Michaels has left, and the jury is really out on him over the past few months, when it comes to in-ring, he is Mr. WrestleMania. They will have access to plenty of preparing ahead of time, shortcuts like tables breaking and double juice, and more creativity in working the match out than any other on the show. The match will have a buzz. It's doubtful it'll be a technical classic. McMahon only went 329, and it was nothing but tests of strength. Of course, he physically looked remarkable for being nearly 61, but at the stage that may be more bad long-term than good. There were no blows and no real bumps, so seemingly out of nowhere, he was bleeding from the ear. It's going to take work from Michaels, because even though the Hogan match 3 years back was no problem, Hogan has that aura at WrestleMania to where, even if the match is terrible, he can keep people's interest in it due to his star power. As for the two title matches, the SmackDown match has been buried in promotion. As a fan, it's got almost no interest, although if Rey Mysterio wins, and with him doing job after job on television, and when was the last Mania challenger for a world title to do that? That actually makes him the favorite in a weird way, but also guarantees people may pop for the moment but not believe in him as a serious champion. Wrestling-wise, it should be the best match on the card. The latter match, with Hardy's experience and Benjamin's ability he showed last year, plus Finlay and Flair, who one would think it could be scary, except he really pulled off the TLC match, and RVD is at least a good daredevil, and well, Lashley at least has guys to cover for him, may be the most spectacular. It certainly has the chance to be a cluster as well. John Cena vs. Triple H will have big-time reaction. There will be plenty of people both loving and hating Cena. Of course, anything can happen and results have been changed on a dime before, but as far as plans go, it's been decided since the day Cena switched brands that Triple H was beating him for the title. A new ad for Backlash has already played this past week, where Cena is in the ad for the match with Triple H saying, "I will take back what was mine," so there you go. Mick Foley vs. Edge has had a pretty good last 2 weeks after an uninspiring start, and it feels somewhat rushed. There is pressure on both of them very big, because part of their storyline revolves around Foley never having a classic Mania match, and Edge is in a position where a bad performance would hurt his momentum. Both Undertaker vs. Mark Henry and Chris Benoit vs. JBL were doing basic practice matches at the house shows over the weekend. Both wanted long matches, in the former case because Undertaker wanted as much ring time with Henry to teach him as much as he could. JBL wanted long matches because he's been off a few weeks after surgery on his hand, and needed the ring conditioning. Reports were Benoit vs. JBL was PPV quality, so there is little to worry about there. From a health standpoint, aside from Kurt Angle's chronic bad neck acting up again this past week, the only major thing to worry about is Boogeyman, who suffered a torn biceps in a practice match with Booker T on March 26 in Oklahoma City. It is possible that match, with Booker and Armel in a handicap bout, could be cancelled, but at press time the idea was they would do a short and careful presentation and that Boogeyman would be out of action mending for a while afterwards. But that match was going to be short under any circumstances, and is hardly make or break on the show. With Angle, with the exception of Shawn Michaels and possibly Bret Hart, nobody has performed at Mania on a consistent basis like he has, and there is little chance the match will be anything worse than really good. Kane and Show vs. Carlito and Masters looks to be a title change as they are trying to market the latter team in a comedy role where they don't like each other but need each other. Kane and Carlito have this weird chemistry where they bring out the absolute worst in each other. It's like you put them together and it looks like two guys in their first match. Show and Masters work together better, but believe me, that's faint praise. The remaining 2 matches on the 4-hour show, which begins at 7 p.m., is Stratus vs. James, which has one of the company's best and its longest-built Mania storyline. But James is questionable at best in the ring. Tori Wilson vs. Candice Michelle in a pillow fight is what it is. The most talked about story of the last week regarding the show was the decision made on March 27 to take Joey Styles off the show and replace him with Jim Ross, during the Raw matches with Jonathan Coachman and Jerry Lawler. Styles was told, and has been told from the start, not to call moves or call the match as a sporting event, but tell stories. It goes against how he was taught. Plus he came into the equation with plenty of people not liking him and waiting to pick on things to call him a failure. He was not used to working with partners, especially one as aggressive in the booth as Coachman, who pretty well takes over when he's out there. No matter how it's sliced, it can't be said it's anything but a major vote of no confidence and a slap in the face. At this point, Styles is expected to remain the lead voice of Raw. But he's in a weird spot because the company has clearly decided Ross is better. Styles was not happy at getting the news, but later claimed that after being disappointed and then mad for about 90 minutes, he claimed he realized he's not where he needs to be for the position. Ross was flown to Omaha to produce the announcers and spent 5 hours both on preparation, the show and after the show working with Styles. Up until that day it was expected Ross would call just one match at Mania, likely McMahon vs. Michaels, and his main focus would be as MC of the Hall of Fame. Instead, Lawler will do so, which is a step down because doing something that requires talking about history, even though Lawler has actually been around wrestling longer than Ross, is far more Ross' forte. The other major issues, and in many people's mind, the real mania in the weekend, is the Hall of Fame ceremony the night before. There were 2 sets of USA Network ads for the 1-hour show, one focusing only on Bret Hart returning home, which is probably not the right way to put it, and the other focusing on honoring both Hart and Eddie Guerrero. Like last year, it is clear the ceremony will be a double main event, and the rest of the group, ranging from very legit legends so very questionable picks, are just the prelim appetizers. You'd only have to bet that in the end there would be issues involving Hart. As noted here, when he accepted, Hart once again said on March 26 in the Calgary Sun that he did not want to be paid for appearing, and that he would not be going to WrestleMania, and would be flying out of Chicago to Toronto, where he has business, the morning of the show. In his mind, being paid for appearing on a wrestling show is a line in the sand he won't cross. Making money doing a DVD, as noted before in his mind, was something different, and quite frankly, one of the motivations in doing so was simply career self-defense. Regarding those who feel by appearing on this show he had sold out in the end, he said, "No one is more tuned into that opinion than I am. I know there are people that feel I sold out, but I don't see it that way. I feel I have a right to be remembered. I'm not trying to be difficult. I just wouldn't want anyone to think I have finally got in bed with them enough that I can accept what they did to me. At this point, I'm set to fly out of Chicago early in the morning before WrestleMania." He also knows what is going to happen this week. They're certainly going to try and sell me on WrestleMania between now and then. They're going to sit me down and talk to me about all kinds of stuff. But I'm not planning on doing anything more than walk out in front of people at the Hall of Fame. That's my only promise. It's really a fine line as to why he can't appear at Mania and simply do a wave, and do this. It's a line he's not willing to cross at this point, but to not cross it will likely require a lot of stubbornness on his part because some very persuasive people have been on him from the start to at least go out there and do the wave. I think most are in agreement that what the company hopes for, which would be for him to play a part in the finish of McMahon vs. Michaels, is unlikely to impossible. There is also a contract issue. All Hall of Fame participants are expected to sign a contract, which includes the standard $5,000 pay, a non-compete clause for a certain length of time as it pertains to appearing on television with an opposition group. Basically, they don't want to promote someone as a Hall of Famer on their TV and then have them appear on TNA, the rights to use them in the Hall of Fame DVD, and the key provision, they are contractually obligated to appear at WrestleMania and be introduced. They've sent me a contract and I don't have any intention of signing it, he said. I know what contracts mean to them. I had a contract and they screwed me over on it. Now they come back to me with a contract 10 years later and ask me to sign it? For what? Many members of the Hart family are coming, including his former wife Julie, his 4 children, and others, including nephew Harry Smith, who most feel is destined for stardom in the business sooner than later, and niece Natty Neidhart, who also wrestles. The reality is, so much advertising has gone out that it would be impossible to cancel Hart's induction over not signing a contract, but at the same time, due to the company wanting to market the ceremony on DVD, they are going to almost have to get him to agree to at least an amended deal. He also told WWE that he didn't want Shawn Michaels at the ceremony, depriving people of the singular bizarre moment of people watching the reaction of people like Michaels, Triple H and Ric Flair, after Hart gave his speech. It was a no-win for all of them, and still is for 2 of them. Either they could come across bad by not standing and clapping at the end of Hart's speech, or they could stand and clap, and it could come across as arguably the single most publicly phony moment in a business often built on that. I've basically told them that if I see Sean, I'll get back in a cab and go straight to the airport. They'll have to get him to do my induction speech. I just feel that there's too much anger for me. Too combustible. Ever since suffering the stroke, Hart has talked about coming out, just once, to say goodbye, but has turned down one opportunity after another to do so. This will give me some closure. I don't carry around any bad blood anymore. I just want to enjoy my life. I have the whole second half of it ahead of me and I plan to make it just as interesting as the first. The other issue that came up over the days before the event was that, due to some sort of an office snafu, or at least that's the best case scenario of trying to explain this, most of the Guerrero family was not even invited to the Hall of Fame, and at press time, was not attending. Vicky and the daughters, and Chavo Jr. were the only family members invited. Chavo Sr. ended up coming as Chavo Jr.'s allowed guest, as opposed to any other family members, but Chavo Sr. also paid his own air transportation to get there. Eddie's mother, Herlinda, wanted to attend, but was never invited. Her daughter, Linda, who works for the airlines, was flying in because she gets free travel for her job, and was using her job to get the mother flown in. Eddie's other sister and two brothers were not attending as of press time, although WWE was said to be aware of it, and at least the reaction we got is they were red-faced regarding how it was handled. Tony Atlas inducted by S.D. Jones, known for more than a month, and the decision to induct former NFL star Bill William the Refrigerator Perry as a celebrity since the show is in Chicago and he was a star in town, with John Cena doing the honors, was announced this past week. Perry was the big media attraction at WrestleMania 2, when he and several other NFL stars were in a battle royal held at the Rosemont Horizon, today known as the Allstate Arena. The funny thing is that event as far as a live show went was something of an embarrassment as only 9,000 fans attended, for a half house. Atlas' career description on Raw wasn't quite as inaccurate as the Blackjack Mulligan bio the week before, but the hyperbole level was off the charts when talking about bodybuilding and powerlifting. It acted as if Atlas was an icon and a legend in both sports, and talked about him as one of the first bodybuilders to go into pro wrestling, when that has been common since the late 40s. Atlas, while he did win a minor version of Mr. USA, promoted by Dan Lurie, which became his nickname the rest of his career. Lurie's organization was neither the weaker organizations of the AAUs, the two biggest, but a very minor third organization that would be equivalent to an indie promotion like CZW or JAPO or PWG's world champion. Actually being talked of like that title was really the WWE belt. Atlas actually entered the real Mr. America contest a few times, and finishing well into the pack. He was Tony Atlas in the small-time shows, but when he was against top-level competition, he entered as Anthony White, his real name. He never had a chance at the top level because his legs weren't up to snuff, but even his super impressive upper body didn't stand out against national-level competition. In fact, in those same contests, Ivan Putski, who used his wrestling name, placed much higher always than Atlas. Atlas was also never a name in powerlifting, as opposed to being a legend like they claimed. He was a strong bench presser, 540 competition max, and set bench press records in Virginia when he was young and may have in Maine as well. Powerlifting is a combination of 3 lifts, and Atlas wasn't strong in the squat because he had comparatively skinny legs. As a wrestler, because he had an incredibly impressive upper body that he may not have been able to peak at national contest level, but unlike most, he could maintain the look year-round, particularly the arms. He was a big attraction first in the Carolinas, and then nationally for his appearances on the Superstation in Atlanta and his teaming with the likes of Tommy Rich and Wrestling Ric Flair and many others. He was in demand and had a run of about 5 years where he was a major player as a not well-spoken, but having a youthish charm as a babyface. He worked many big promotions like Mid-South and Houston, booked off his Atlanta exposure, and eventually moved to WWF, where in his first run, he was always protected and did no jobs. If he challenged a heel for the title, he'd win via count out or DQ. He later held the tag title, but by that point, his star had fallen because more bodybuilders were coming in and he was very limited in the ring. He was fired several times, for good reasons ranging from drug problems to no-shows, and never really a big star again. In a shocking move, longtime executive director of the Nevada State Athletic Commission Mark Ratner resigned effective May 13 to take job as a vice president for Zuffa, the parent company of the UFC. Ratner will start with his new position on May 15. The exact title is not defined, but he believes it will be something along with lines of Vice President of Regulatory Affairs. Ratner, 61, began with the commission in 1985, and has headed it since 1992. It was the approval of UFC in Nevada in 2001 that was one of the steps, but not the only step, in getting the promotion back on PPV, and eventually television, to become the very successful entity it has turned into. Ratner was approached by the promotion at the end of the year about working for them, in an undefined role. The Fertittas evidently made a strong money offer, since Ratner has said, in the end, he had to think of doing the right thing for his family when he made his decision. Ratner is considered one of the most respected people in the entire boxing industry, and most insiders felt that if a national boxing commission that Senator John McCain has been pushing for was put into effect, he would be the best candidate to head it. The Nevada Commission is the most influential in the country, and as such, Ratner has been one of the most powerful forces in the boxing world, and as such, has considerable respect among the sports media even if boxing itself doesn't. The commission also regulates pro wrestling, although obviously not as closely. When first approached, he said he didn't want to discuss it seriously until after the Fernando Vargas vs. Shane Mosley fight at the end of February. He said they had been in serious talks the next 2 weeks, and he made the decision on March 16, which was made public in a press release by UFC the next day. The hiring of Ratner is a far bigger step in the evolution of UFC and MMA than it appears on the surface. Ratner has worked closely with every major commission that has had a major fight, and his reputation is tremendous in that world, amazing since that's very hard when it comes to boxing. UFC is attempting to gain sports legitimacy at being regulated and legalized throughout the US, as well as to be treated as a serious sport in the media. While the breakthroughs over 5 years that the company has made have been pretty incredible if you look back, most major media coverage of the sport has still focused on the blood sport or barrack lines as opposed to covering it the way boxing is covered. Just this past week, a few different municipalities have had city councils talk about banning it. It is still illegal in New York, and it's very clear Zuffa wants to turn that law around and run a big event in Madison Square Garden or other major arenas in the state. Currently, MMA is sanctioned by state boxing commissions in 20 of the approximately 40 states where they exist. Although stories talk about it being banned in various places, outside of New York, I don't believe there is a state where it is truly banned by law, and most states have some small promotions. There are commission states that the commission doesn't allow it to take place, which is where Ratner's influence is expected to be felt. From the media standpoint, the March 28 USA Today article was the perfect example. The story linked UFC with Talman competition even though there is no comparison, and Talman is actually better defined as boxing with inexperienced or untrained boxers, which is a recipe for disaster. The article insinuated that the March 10 San Jose show that drew the sellout was a Talman contest, and grouped UFC and Talman together as the two most popular promotions under the heading Extreme Fighting. It claimed UFC as the hottest version, claiming because it has the Spike TV contract, and did not UFC fighters are professionals and Talman fighters are inexperienced, and noted at least 10 people have died in the sport, but gave the impression that they were largely the same thing. The article listed the UFC as bare-handed, good research, professionals battle in a cage with first, feet and legs until an opponent is knocked out or gives up. It claimed that since 2001, UFC banned head-butting in 1996, added weight classes in 1997, and began a scoring system, 1995, and had medical testing of fighters, 1993. It also claimed the highest-paid UFC fighter gets $1.5 million. It is unknown what Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture ended up with from their February 4th fight because each got a percentage of the PPV revenue, but it is believed they both ended up with high 6 figures or low 7 figures because the PPV did so well, even though both's listed base pay was closer to $250,000. Because of the conflict of interest, Ratner will have no involvement in the overseeing of the April 6 Ultimate Fight Night show in Las Vegas, although he will be in attendance. Keith Kaiser, who works with Ratner as the Deputy Attorney General on the commission, seems to be the favorite to replace him. The hiring of Ratner does bring questions in hindsight, since Ratner was influential, although he did not have a vote, in Nevada sanctioning the sport, without which UFC would very possibly no longer exist, and absolutely couldn't be anywhere near his level. Ratner has known UFC owner Lorenzo Fertitta for years, as Fertitta was a longtime commission member. The background of his purchase of the company has its own interesting story. In 2000, with the company on its last legs, owner Bob Merowitz attempted to get it sanctioned in Nevada, after getting it successfully sanctioned in New Jersey. At the time, it was believed Nevada's sanctioning was the domino that would take the company from rags to riches. The belief at the time is with Nevada's sanctioning, it would return to PPV. At the time, DirecTV was still carrying UFC events and doing about 15,000 buys in coverage in roughly 18% of the country. Taking those numbers to the other 82% would mean more than 80,000 buys, which is enough to be at least break-even or somewhat profitable. Merowitz was given the impression he would be sanctioned, but was given the bad news the night before the meeting that he did not have the votes and would be voted down. By pulling out, he would be able to try and submit a bid again at another time, but going in and officially being voted down would make it extremely difficult to ever get sanctioning. He pulled out, and at that point Fertitta, knowing Merowitz was in financial problems and couldn't make money with it, offered to buy it. Fertitta was childhood friends with Dana White, who was a UFC insider because he was the manager at the time of Tito Ortiz, the company's biggest star. As it turned out, the UFC numbers at first didn't increase to anywhere near the level expected, as some shows did as low as 35,000 buys. But the Ortiz vs. Ken Shamrock fight on November 22, 2002, did 150,000 buys and was the beginning of turning the company around. The TV deal with Spike TV was the final step, as it garnered tons of new fans and made the top fighters into well-known sports figures, at least to high school and younger adult males, who, theoretically, would be the consumers of the future. Merowitz attempted to keep a minority interest in the company, but the Fertittas, Lorenzo and brother Frank, who are worth several hundreds of millions of dollars each from their ownership of station casinos, insisted on buying 100%. Obviously Mark's reputation is impeccable and his knowledge is first-rate, and people like that are the kinds of people we want working for us, Lorenzo Fertitta said to the Las Vegas Review-Journal. He's very knowledgeable about mixed martial arts and he's one of the most knowledgeable guys anywhere about combat sports, and MMA is a combat sport. It's quite the turnaround for Ratner, who in 1996, debated with McCain against Ken Shamrock and Merowitz on Larry King Live for the abolishment of MMA. There were rule changes since the debate, although not as many as is claimed publicly. They added rounds and used the boxing 10-point must-scoring system, as opposed to judging on the fight as a whole. Weight classes were instituted in late 1997 when the company was trying to build around Olympic gold medalist Kevin Jackson, signed when rival EFC folded, as a world champion. Ironically, in a match everyone in the company expected Jackson to win handily, he was submitted in 14 seconds by Frank Shamrock, who became the company's biggest star during the next 2 years, but those were dark ages for the sport. As far as the fight itself went, the biggest changes were eliminations of knees on the ground and banning of headbutts, both traits that hindered the heavyweight wrestlers like Mark Coleman, Mark Kerr, and Don Fry, who were dominating the sport. To show the respect Ratner had, on March 25, Kevin Iole, the boxing writer of the Review-Journal, wrote that if you can always find someone to say something bad about anyone, particularly in the boxing business, and then said Ratner was the exception to the rule. Iole, one of the only boxing writers who covers MMA as a sport, noted that the sport is a ratings success on TV, does great numbers live and on PPV, and is a huge hit with males 18 to 34, but the mainstream media generally reports on it as a sideshow. As noted, after the record-setting March 10 show in San Jose, the AP and all but one newspaper covering the event wrote more about a bloodthirsty audience, and didn't cover it as if it were a sporting event like a hockey game or boxing match. Any boxing match that does numbers like Little Couture or even BJ Penn versus Georges St. Pierre would get at least wire service coverage in most major papers and be covered by ESPN and CNN, Sports Illustrated, as well as most TV sportscasts. The biggest boxing matches still do more business, but Vargas Mosley, boxing's biggest fight of the year so far, did roughly the same live gate, sold less tickets, and was only a little ahead in PPV, yet got 100 times the media coverage. Little Couture as a fight and a title match received minimal coverage. Iole wrote that Ratner's hiring will change that. Mike Tenay, who lives in Las Vegas and is very well connected to the sports and sports politics of the city, said that UFC just bought themselves instant sports credibility. Lineups have been announced for Season 3 of Spike TV's Ultimate Fighter, which debuts with a 90-minute special from 10 to 11:30 p.m. on April 6 after a live fight show from Las Vegas. The show, coached by Ken Shamrock and Tito Ortiz, features fighters earmarked for the 185 and 205-pound divisions, and has several interesting characters. But the reality is, the caliber of fighters for the most part is worlds below the first 2 seasons. They are mostly inexperienced fighters, several past 30, and on paper, each weight class seems to have one major standout. In fact, at 205 pounds, barring injury or a huge upset, it appears the entire competition is based around creating a company British star in Michael Bisping of Liverpool. The show will be airing weekly on a 1-day tape delay from its US debut, in England, on the Bravo channel, starting April 7th. At this point, it has not been released which fighters will start on which teams, but it's likely that will be the focus of the first episode of the show. At 205 pounds, Christian Roth Armel, he holds a 4-2 record and is 33 years old. The only name on his resume is a loss to Jeremy Horn. Matt Hamill, a fighter with an interesting resume and story. He is a wrestler who is believed to have had no MMA matches. But he trains under Jorge Gergel on the team with Rich Franklin. Legally deaf, he was the 1999 NCAA Division III champion at 197 pounds as well as most outstanding wrestler in the tournament. In 2004 he was elected to the Division III Sports Hall of Fame. In 1997, he was also a gold medalist in the World Games for the Deaf in wrestling, winning in both freestyle and Greco-Roman, and was the first American to do so. He's been featured in Sports Illustrated. Michael Bisping, the 26-year-old, is a strong favorite in what appears to be a weak weight class. He holds a 10-0 record, with only 2 matches lasting 1 round, and he's stopped every opponent cleanly with numerous submissions as well as knockouts. Tate Fletcher, with a 3-1 record, Fletcher, 34, trains with Joe Rogan. Josh Haynes, a member of Team Quest, he has a 7-4 record with his highest profile match being a loss to a much smaller Shoney Carter. He's likely to be, like Hamill, pushed because he has a story, as his oldest son had brain cancer at birth. Noah Inhafer, listed as having a 22-4 record, but we can only find records of 2 fights, a win and a loss, with the loss coming to Mike Nichols, who is also on the show. He's a student at the University of South Dakota. Jesse Forbes, a 21-year-old training partner of UFC regular Drew Fickett. He's listed at 2-0. Mike Nichols, 34 years old jiu-jitsu specialist with a 3-1 record. His only loss came to Craig Zellner, who some wrestling fans may remember as Leigh Thatcher wrestling student Ray Steele. At 185 pounds. Caleb Starnes, ranked number 2 in Canada as a middleweight, he's got a reported 8-0-1 record. Of the 7 fights we can find records of, he has 6 wins, all in the first round, mostly via submission. A favorite to at least make the finals. Danny Abity, we can't find an MMA record on him, but he claims a 14-1 pro kickboxing record. Solomon Hutcherson, listed as being 10-2. The verified numbers on him are 6-1, but his only match with a named fighter was a first-round knockout loss to Jorge Rivera. Ross Poindon, a British fighter, from Stoke-on-Trent, he comes in with a 4-6 record, and worse, has lost 6 of his last 7 fights. There are only 2 named fighters on his resume, both very fast knockout losses against Valentijn Overeem and Bisping. Ed Herman, a clear favorite in the division, coming in with a 10-3 record. Another fighter out of Team Quest, which was Randy Couture's original team with Dan Henderson and Matt Lindland, and spawned early Ultimate Fighter stars Nate Quarry and Chris Levin. His only recent losses have been to Kazuo Misaki in Tangled Armlock, in the first round of the 2004 Pancrase Neo Blood Tournament, and to Joe Dirksen Triangle Choke, who has been in several UFCs. His last 2 fights were first-round TKO wins over Nick Thompson and well-known MMA name Dave Mena. He's also beaten Brian Ebersole. All of his losses have been via submission. Rory Singer, an experienced fighter who is Forrest Griffin's main trainer. He's 8-5, and his highest profile match was losing via decision to pro wrestler Daijiro Matsui in the main event of a minor Pride show on October 20, 2002, at Korakuen Hall. He was also choked out in the first round by former UFC fighter Dennis Hallman last year. Because of that, he's at least a name coming in. Mike Stein, billed at 3-0, but we can only find record of 1 fight, a 21 seconds TKO win, in late 2003. Kendall Groves, a native of Hawaii with a 5-3-1 record. His last match was a prelim at the October 7th Rumble on the Rock show in Honolulu, beating Jay Carter in the first round with a triangle choke. Now 23 2 years ago he suffered a first-round knockout loss to Joe Riggs. There are a lot of people I want to thank for help on the following story, from Frank Defford of Sports Illustrated for his help in putting her talents into a real perspective, to former roller derby skater Jim Fitzpatrick, Roller Games insider Curtis Minato, and a few others who know who they are and are better left unmentioned who did so much extensive research on the time period just based on curiosity of where this all came from. I'd also like to thank Steve Cheverini for maintaining an archive on what would be otherwise long-lost records that helped make sense of the various stories and faded memories and put them into their correct historical context, and the many different readers who pointed me in the direction and encouraged me to tackle this project. And believe me, this has been a project like few others. When Ann Calvello passed away 2 weeks ago, I received an inordinate amount of phone calls and many emails saying that I need to do the big bio of her. At first I thought this was not the place for it, and it completely intimidated me because of the time it would need. I also thought anything longer than 2 pages would take up too much space for a story that I thought at first would only interest a small percentage of readers, but I also knew that was impossible. Even without talking to anyone, I've been living here long enough and had dealt with Calvello from watching her live on Sunday afternoons and Monday nights every summer growing up, to doing an award-nominated feature on her in college, to seeing her around wrestling for decades, to being at the world premiere of the movie on her life. To know that do this story justice, there were only two choices. Do it right or don't do it at all. Rather than isolate Calvello's life as a vacuum, to put it into its perspective, we have to look at the world she came from, and some of the personalities that made it tick. For those who think it's a waste of space, you're getting a double issue for the price of a single. For those who don't, you're getting what the few who have read it have already told me is one of the best issues of The Observer ever. She spawned Madonna, socialized with Bob Hope, and had liaisons with NFL players, major celebrities, a #1 man on the FBI's most wanted list, and at least 3 members of the WWE Hall of Fame. She was the inspiration for the springing up of dozens and dozens of leagues around North America full of people wanting to be her, almost all of whom weren't even born in her heyday. In her home San Francisco Bay Area, she was almost an area icon, eulogized this past week on television as the Babe Ruth of her sport. While most of the mainstream national press largely ignored her in her heyday, she was embraced locally in her later years as the most colorful character of a fondly remembered period of Bay Area history. She was perhaps the only person who could pull off being a national celebrity in her youth, still being in the public eye in her 70s, while working a 9-to-5 job bagging groceries at Safeway in Millbrae, and not have it come across as the slightest bit sad. In life, she was, according to Jerry Seltzer, who owned the business that made her famous, much larger than roller derby, and in death, much larger than probably she herself could have even imagined. And Calvello, who passed away on March 14 due to liver cancer at the age of 76, was the greatest villain in the history of the roller derby. Derby was, and in its various incarnations today, a pseudo-sport, almost a pro wrestling on wheels, that thrived at various times on television, and then, on a major league basis, died at the end of 1973. Called the greatest villain ever in sports this week in Sports Illustrated, I would agree with best woman performing villain in American sports, and even qualify that by saying performer because Tonya Harding is the most famous American female sports villain, but couldn't go farther than that. There was never a female performer in pro wrestling that played heel that could hold a candle to her. When it came to interviews, histrionics, timing, or ability to play a live crowd, she was not the greatest in the history of sports, but only the best of the male wrestlers. And we're talking people the caliber of a Freddie Blassie, were at or above her level. Roller derby was a part of working-class America, skating summers in the San Francisco Bay Area, and playing to sell-out houses all winter, doing one-night stands at the biggest arenas in the rest of the country. Her rival, Joni Weston, was probably one of America's 3 most famous women athletes of the 60s, along with Billie Jean King and Peggy Fleming. It was an article by Frank Deford in 1997 when Weston died at the age of 62, that was read by TNN executives who decided to resurrect roller derby. The failed roller jam, with skaters recruited largely for looks, fresh-faced beauties with large implants and flat stomachs, posing in bikini calendars, and steroid-enhanced men, had more of a sterile game show feel than the gritty reality that made the old sport popular. Joni's husband, Nick Skopas, cried at the open of the new league, noting that Joni's goal for nearly 25 years was to bring roller derby back. To the point she had built her own training center for a sport that barely existed, but in the end, she had to die to accomplish her goal. Even more sad was the reality that her death only led to another failed opportunity. Skopas, like all the derby people who helped start Roller Jam, was embarrassed very quickly by what it turned into. Jerry Seltzer, whose father invented and promoted the game, and who took it over and made it big again, was brought in by TNN to be a consultant. At an early meeting, in talking about the direction, with Seltzer talking about how to take it on tour and what cities to run, a 25-year-old executive made a comment to him about how that may have worked in his day, but times were different and that's not going to be how we are going to do things. TNN wanted Vince Russo professional wrestling on wheels, filled with wacky and totally unbelievable storylines, thinking that's what was hot on TV that year. Seltzer walked out of the meeting. As per his deal, he appeared on the show as the TV commissioner, but it was clear fast his heart wasn't into it. The operation opened with twice the audience either TNA or ECW opened with on the station, and even more than UFC opened with, and had no help from a giant Raw lead-in. But it went downhill fast. But in one of the final episodes before it was cancelled in 2000, Calvello was brought in for a match race at the age of 71. She was very unsteady on the track by that point. She had already battled brain cancer and hadn't even been on skates in 3 years. But it did allow her bragging rights to say she skated professionally in 7 different decades. As she also noted to friends, she was treated more as a star by management there than she ever was during her long skating career. She was treated by the skaters like Babe Ruth himself came back from the dead to watch over spring training. But it was Calvello, due to her style and personality, who became the enduring symbol of the modern version roller derby. She was the prototype for the underground world of all women skaters in leagues in every major city in North America, adopting punk rock personas, wearing sexy outfits, but hardly looking like the TV star looks of Roller Jam crew. It was more a world filled with trashy women you'd expect to see at dive bars, a world of heavy drinking and tattoos. But even though it didn't even fare as well on television as Roller Jam, with not even the big first few weeks ratings, and it was clear within a few weeks it was a television flop, the people involved were there to have fun and escape from their normal lives, not to be television stars, and it clearly has more legs. Currently, there are more than 80 documented all-girl punk rocker-style leagues in North America that have been based, the early ones on purpose, and probably most others without even knowing it, on the character Calvello made famous in the 60s. And in a sense that was probably a world Calvello would have loved to have been a part of, since it was what kept her on the track regularly until she was 68 years old, and fighting against women half her age was replaced by fighting for her life after being diagnosed with brain cancer. This past year, when a Bay Area girls league just starting out, with skaters who didn't even have a clue how to play the game, was raising money to run the league by having men spank the women skaters, Calvello, brought to the event as the celebrity guest, remarked that the skaters had a lot to learn about the game. But she sure liked their style. Just a few weeks before her death, the Ayonde Roller Girls show that was just canceled aired an episode where some of the Texas skaters went to the Bay Area to meet the woman whose persona was responsible for the latest rebirth. In an episode scheduled to air on April 2nd, she is flown down to Austin, Texas, to present the trophy to the winner of the league's championship, called the Calvello Cup. Calvello herself loved being in the media, who actually made her an enduring legend when everyone else from her era and the game's history was largely forgotten. Everyone who ever promoted roller derby noted that no matter who it is, if they wanted to do a story, Calvello was always up for it. She'd meet reporters for lunch and even take them to her apartment in San Bruno that was filled with 1,000 different Lions souvenirs, from stuffed animals to pendants to photos, because she noted constantly that she was a Leo, which meant she always said what was on her mind. Long after roller derby died, she was a regular on sports talk shows, largely because of the legend she had when an early 70s appearance set the all-time record for calls in the early days of area sports talk radio. She talked sports, trends, or almost anything, and was always brash and opinionated, and you never knew what subject would come up and where the conversation would go. She was the subject of a movie documentary, the 2001 release Demon of the Derby, that chronicled her life, and a photo book largely based on her career, called Roller Derby Classics and More, was released by close friend Jim Fitzpatrick a few months ago. All three other books on the history of the Derby all had chapters on her, and a fourth Derby novel had the lead villain completely based on her. Older fans remember Anne and Joni. Almost nobody called them by their last names because they came across as, and actually were, the type of people who were on a first-name basis with almost everyone they came in contact with. People remember them going at it for years and years. But in reality, their heyday as rivals in televised games from, in the familiar terms of announcer Walt Harris, from Keyser Pavilion in Golden Gate Park in the city of San Francisco, was only from 1967-71. That was the period where the Joni-led San Francisco Bay Bombers would skate various hill visiting teams captained by Annie, whether they be called the Northeast Braves, the Midwest Pioneers, or the Brooklyn Red Devils, none of whom at the time ever played home games in the parts of the country they were supposedly to have been from. The roller derby of the 60s and early 70s was a world full of stars that in many ways never outgrew the 50s, when the derby of Jerry's father, Leo Seltzer, was one of the biggest hits in the early days of television. The men still wore their hair in pompadours like James Dean or Elvis Presley, and many of the women dressed like Bobby Soxers. Its biggest star, the real Babe Ruth of the roller derby, was a skating phenomenon legitimately tough as nails scrapper named Charlie O'Connell, who, although known simply as Charlie, wasn't the kind of a guy who would be on a first-name basis with almost anyone. But at the time he was the symbol of an entire sport. The three big stars had their roles and specific reasons. Charlie was feared by his fellow skaters because he was the real article, and the biggest drawing card. He was the only one who, by the standards of the time, made big money at it. A kid from the streets of New York who got into skating and owned a house on a Bill Hill in the San Francisco suburbs, made more than all but the top real athletes in the major league sports did in the 60s. Charlie, whose nickname said it all, Mr. Roller Derby, was equally adept at skating white shirt, home team, or babyface in wrestling parlance, as red shirt, visiting team, or heel. He was a 6'2", 190 pounds when he was in his best shape, ferocious character in a world inhabited by mostly small men. Charlie was the most popular and biggest draw because he was the top white shirt skater, but his only endearing quality was he was the best at what he did. He was perhaps even more hated as a red shirt because he had an aura of being almost unstoppable, as nearly everyone in the league let him do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, in the games, because almost everyone genuinely feared him. Only a few, both in the fantasy world as well as the very real world that also existed as a hidden subplot in the games, would dare go toe-to-toe with him. Charlie hated dealing with people, and even though he was the biggest star, almost never dealt with the media. Even in the wake of the death of Calvello, he didn't speak anywhere, including for this story. He was aloof, barely acknowledged fans, and almost never signed autographs, but still Defford compared his character with a almost real-life version of a Gary Cooper or a John Wayne as a guy who didn't say much, but his actions did the talking. Even though he dated several women skaters and married 2 of them, Charlie was not a fan of the women's product. The men skated a faster, harder and more exciting game, but it was the women that gave the derby its unique personality. The women always believed they were the actual draws, and there is little question it was the case in the 50s heyday. But O'Connell would openly give them no respect. Most of the time he wouldn't go out during the pregame warm-ups, since he didn't like to sign autographs, and at least this allowed him to not have to skate around and ignore all the autograph seekers, which sometimes he did as well. He'd come out of the dressing room midway through the first period, stealing the thunder from the women on the track. Most of the time when the women skated, instead of watching the game like a coach would, he'd skate back to the dressing room. But it didn't work both ways. Once, when a women's captain left a game early, rather than stayed for the final period where the men would decide the outcome, Charlie went to teach a lesson. At a game in the small town of Petaluma, Charlie and Ken Monty did the infamous 14 overtime game. Derby games rarely ended in ties, for credibility or perhaps for an angle where they wanted Joni to score the winning points. Overtime games did happen on rare occasions, even though the scores were always close. Rules were in a tie, the women would get a 5-minute sudden death overtime period to decide it. That would usually mean the women decided it on the first jam. If by some reason the women didn't score, the men would come out, but in the end, no game could end in a tie. Charlie's argument is, how could a top woman star leave early? Because, logically, if it's a tie, you'd have to come out and skate the overtime. Charlie told the women after the men left the game as a tie, only that the men were deciding the outcome, and if anyone scored in the women's period, they were not going to like the consequences. So the women didn't score in the first period, as they were told, figuring the men would decide it. The men wouldn't score because, as legend has it, Charlie and Monty were having so much fun banging the hell out of each other, teaching the women a lesson, and didn't want to go home yet. The women had to come back out, and when the men didn't score in the 4th overtime, they realized something was up. By the time it was over, both sides had to skate the equivalent to almost an additional game, but without scoring 1 point, the average derby game would have both teams score about 40 points, while T-Bird's roller games, with little defense involved, usually came close to 100 points for each team. The game went past midnight and most of the spectators went home before it was decided, and nobody seems to actually remember who won, only that the women learned a lesson that night and never dared leave early. Joni was known as the Golden Girl as well as the Blonde Amazon. She was a natural athlete who excelled at every sport she tried. She was a teenage softball legend growing up, batting .730 and breaking all school hitting records during her freshman year in college before leaving school to join the Derby at the age of 19. After taking it up when she was older on frequent vacations to Hawaii during the off-season, she could surf at nearly a professional level. The book on her was she probably could have been a star in any sport she devoted herself to. In the early 50s, the only professional sports avenue for a woman was roller derby. She had skated in roller rinks growing up in Los Angeles, and just out of high school, she and her high school best friend, who later became a fairly well-known star herself using the stage name Tony Tag, showed up before a game and asked to try out for the Los Angeles Braves. 3 days later, she was skating on a professional team, if you call earning $7 a game professional. A year later, she was considered one of the best skaters in the league. In some ways, she was the female equivalent of Charlie, as both were big, athletic, and fast on their feet. But in reality, they were completely different. Joni had the bleached blonde hair, her size, at 5'10" and 160 pounds, look and the way she carried herself gave her almost a regal presence on the track. She was the most popular skater in the league, and while far more an athlete than any kind of sex symbol, she was the hero to a generation of young women and children, as well as, not surprisingly, to the lesbian community in San Francisco. Unlike the rest of Derby that seemed caught in the past, visual standout was Anna Teresa Banana Nose Calvello, who with her multicolored hair, sense of style both on and off heat track, tattoos and color, was like a character transported from today's pop culture into a time machine back 40 years. However real roller derby was or wasn't, what was very real was that the greatest women's rivalry in American sports before the days of Chris Evert versus Martina Navratilova in tennis was Ann versus Joni. Their battles were syndicated on television all over the United States on a network of 120 stations. The shows played in most markets on Saturday or Sunday afternoons, in those days when sports were king on weekend afternoon television. Even though the games were taped, and had no context when it came to standings, and results hardly seemed to matter or were ever referred to again unless it was the annual championship playoffs, they beat most anything on television during that time unless they were put against the NFL. They regularly beat the live NBA and Major League Baseball games in many markets. In San Francisco on Sundays during the home summer season, from 5:30 to 7 p.m. on KTVU, CH2, during its peak in the 60s, more people often watched roller derby than saw Bonanza, and that was the most popular show on television at the time, airing on NBC later that night in prime time. Anne, who was 5'6" and about 135 pounds, but because of her persona, is likely remembered as being much bigger, was by no means the best skater in the 38-year history of a sport that has had a million failed attempted revivals over the past 3 decades. But she will be remembered as such by many, because without a doubt, she was the most interesting, most talked about, and most enduring figure. Perhaps the most stunning was the reaction to her death. One would have figured in the San Francisco Bay Area, it would get a good deal of attention. There were stories in every newspaper, as well as a 9-minute feature on one of the local newscasts that was promoted all day, with host Gary Radnick having to fight back tears while the other anchors were practically rolling their eyes, unable to conceive of why so much attention was being devoted to a roller derby skater. But surprisingly, she got coverage in most major market newspapers, with major write-up in the Los Angeles Times and New York Times, not to mention small stories in both Sports Illustrated and even Time magazine. Defford said that if she played an uptown sport, she'd be remembered in the same company as Babe Didrikson, Chris Evert, and Peggy Fleming. It was really apropos that her death was ignored by the CNN's and ESPN sports centers of the world. She grew up in a world where they didn't exist. In her world, it got no bigger than the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and Time. Contrast that to Ken Monty, who died quietly, to absolutely no fanfare in 2004, even though he also lived in the Bay Area, but he hadn't been part of the local scene for the most part since his retirement in 1971. He did a brief comeback in 1977. Monty was every bit the star as Calvello within roller derby, but his name did not transcend the game. They were the only two who were national stars during the early 50s when derby was all over network television, and were still stars when syndicated television created the second boom. Monty, in fact, was clearly a bigger star than Ann in the first boom, as he was one of the first athletes to get a national TV endorsement for Lucky cigarettes, and as Charlie's fiercest rival and generally regarded as the number 2 derby men's player of all time, was really higher if there was an official food chain of stars during the 60s. Defford, considered by many as America's greatest sportswriter in history, knew Calvello for nearly 4 decades. He went on a derby winter tour of one-night stands in 1969, sent by Sports Illustrated to do a feature on what was becoming a television phenomenon, as it was previously in the early 50s, and then seemed to disappear for many years except to its ardent fans. When getting word of her death, he tried to figure out how to sell the idea of a story on her. He strongly believed the story was warranted, but also felt, due to the nature of her sport, that it would be quite the political fight for him. When the New York Times did a big write-up, he thought the sell job would be easier because that gave his idea credibility. He was going to use that story as evidence when he called up and found SI had been searching for photos of her and wanted and expected him to be doing a story. "It's such a shame she didn't live to see just how well she's been remembered," said Defford, who always believed that roller derby, like wrestling, would always come back. "I think she'd have been surprised. The movie, The Calvello Cup, and this, has certified her legacy. It's really the end of an era, as she's the last one." Charlie disappeared, now 71. Charlie disappeared from the roller derby scene in 1979, and now lives with his wife, one of the top female skaters of that era, Judy McGuire, shuttling between their 2 homes in Brentwood and Palm Springs. Joni died young. This is really it. To fully tell the story of Ann Calvello would probably require a book in itself, or at least a movie. You'd first have to explain roller derby, a world somewhat like wrestling that has been written about in a few books, but the inside details have never been talked about publicly. Some ardent fans of derby and wrestling note that so many people have written stories dating back to the 30s on the inside of wrestling, but not one roller derby skater, even someone who only lasted a year or two, has ever publicly given the inside scoop on the game. Roller derby was formed in 1935 in Chicago by Leo Seltzer, a promoter looking for a live arena attraction. At first, it was men and women in a skating marathon, going in circles until they collapsed of exhaustion, similar to dance marathons that were the craze at the time. The marathons worked in some cities, and flopped in others. A popular part of the marathon is when they would have a few lap speed skating races. During those races, like an Olympic speed ice skating, there would be body contact. Since this was designed far more an entertainment novelty than a true sport, when the crowd would get into that part of the show more than the endless skating in circles, Seltzer, along with Damon Runyon, the most legendary sportswriter of his time and a big fan, noticed the reaction. After a 1937 game in Miami, the two set out changing the marathon into a sport, and came up with the rules, and basically in that one night, invented a sport that quickly wasn't quite a sport. The game would be a series of jams, or in football terms, plays. There would be alternating periods with women and men. The belief was that the women, who were mostly out of high school or their early 20s, athletic and generally in better condition than most women of that period, were really the draws, even if the men provided the faster and harder hitting action. Games would be 8 periods, women skating 1, 3, 5 and 7. The basic rules were the game was 5-on-5, with 2 jammers or sprinters starting a play at the back of the pack, breaking free and speeding around to get to the rest of the pack skaters. For every member of the opposing team they passed, they would get 1 point. To pass skaters meant either outracing them, or more often, having a teammate physically knock them out of the way. Jammers on each team would break free, and while sprinting, attempt to eliminate the opposing team's jammer, generally using elbow blocks, but sometimes knees, shoulders, or hips. Anything but punching, kicking, and wrestling were legal both on the jams, and by the blockers when they reached the back of the pack to both open up holes on the opposition to score, or to stop the jammer from passing. The jammers were small and speedy. The lead blockers on each team, who were generally the top stars, were usually bigger and more experienced. Around 1962, the pivot position with its shiny black helmet was created, usually for the top player on the team, who usually was the lead blocker, but had the option, if a jammer started the play, to score points himself. The position was created for Charlie himself, so a few times a game, the big stars like Charlie, Joni, and Ann would go out on the chase and jam, and those would be the hottest plays of the game. But what made derby was the aggressive physicality, the hard blocking at fast speeds, and perhaps even more, the fights, which were most often staged. In the 40s, they relied on newspaper promotion and posters with photos of the prettier girls in tight-fitting uniforms and short tights with their hair all made up, and guys brawling, usually with Leo's catchphrase, "Hell on Wheels." Even before the days of television in 1941, with 8 teams and as many as 4 games per night, legend has it the Derby drew 4 million fans, mostly in the Midwest and West Coast. That figure is almost surely exaggerated, but there are small newspaper clippings from those years which talk about selling about what today would be Meade-sized arenas. The few attempts in New York, in those days the only city that mattered, didn't take. Then the war took most of the male skaters, and the operation limped along for a few years. In those days, games were held for 1, or 2 or even 3-week stands, in the same arena, and then they moved to a new arena in a new city similar to the Barnum and Bailey Circus today. The track was so difficult to set up and take down that they couldn't go from city to city like in the 60s. The skaters actually lived in the arenas, sleeping on cots. Since they were mostly young, an older authority figure was there to make sure the men stayed in their rooms and the women stayed in their rooms. They traveled with a professional cook who would make their meals. Anne joked that in her early years on the circuit, there were rats in the buildings they stayed so large they would steal her peanut butter sandwiches, and cockroaches so big they would try to steal her suitcases. Naturally, the biggest game was not played before the fans, but later in the arena, figuring out how to subterfuge the authority and score big off the track. This was the world Annie walked into shortly out of high school. Anne was born in Newport, Rhode Island, on August 1, 1929. Her father was in the Navy, and they traveled a lot when she was growing up. She was the oldest of 6 kids, and when she was 11, her family moved to San Francisco. She was a star basketball player at Presentation High School, leading her team to championships in 3 of her 4 years on varsity. She claimed she was a straight A student in high school, and was known for being blunt, with an incredible memory for details, and for being honest, oftentimes brutally so. Still, the straight A's were disputed by her classmates, a few of whom were moms of my best friends growing up, who remembered her for being a non-stop talker, and a tomboy who regularly got into trouble. Women in those days were not encouraged to be competitive in sports, so she hung around mostly with guys, drinking, playing sports, telling dirty jokes and raising hell. One of her hangouts was the roller rink, where she would skate and race with the guys, because none of the girls could compete with her. A version of roller derby, actually a competing league called the International Roller Speedway, came into Oakland for a tour. Some of her friends went to a game and wanted to get in. Anne at the time had never heard of or seen roller derby. The promotion wasn't necessarily looking for good skaters, but they were looking for pretty girls to take on a European tour. Anne was by no means the prettiest girl in school, but she had what were called killer genes. Basically, she had a great body that she was able to keep intact for decades. If her daughter was any indication, had Anne not worshipped the sun, which aged her face so badly, she easily could have passed for being 15 or 20 years younger. Terry Conti she married and has since divorced one of the members of the famed band Tower of Power, and if the last name sounds familiar, the first cousin of her ex-husband is the famed Victor Conti, is now 52. She didn't share her mother's love for being in the sun for 8 hours a day. The last time I saw her at the Demon of the Derby premiere in 2001, she looked like a hot 28-year-old. Indeed, in the Bay Area, and especially among people familiar with wrestling, and this was said even when she was in her early 60s by people who more than had their pick of the lot, shall we say, Annie's talents off the track, her sexual proclivity, were considered even more impressive than her talents at riling the audience and creating havoc on the track. It was her body that got her into the game, it was her skating that made her a star, and it was her uniqueness that made her much bigger than the game itself. At roughly the same time Anne's tour came back from Europe, the real roller derby was becoming a national phenomenon. In November of 1948, Leo Seltzer brought his derby troupe to New York, the home of network television, once again hoping to somehow make it in a market that they could never get any attention in. TV was in its infancy and really just looking to fill time. The people who ran the networks never even heard of roller derby. After being turned down everywhere, somehow Leo managed to cheaply sell TV rights for a 13-week run to CBS. Roller derby's first game on network television was November 29, 1948, at the 5,300-seat 69th Regiment Armory for a game between the New York Chiefs and the Brooklyn Red Devils. There were about 500 people at the game, maybe 100 paid. Once again, it looked like derby was going to tank in New York. After a fight between Jerry Murray, the Johnny of her time as captain of the Chiefs and most popular skater, and Midge Tuffy Brage, the highly troubled but most famous skater of her day, shall we say, popped the territory. Police on horseback had to come because ticket lines were so long for the game the next night. Most of the rest of the games, held 6 nights a week for the entire run, in the Armory were sold out. And soon they upgraded to Madison Square Garden. All 4 networks were calling when the CBS contract expired at the end of February, 1949. The Derby, and particularly Murray and Tuffy, were on the front page of the newspapers and featured in national magazines. ABC won the bidding war, for what at the time was huge money, $5,000 per week for broadcast rights to air up to 12 hours of Derby action per week for the next 2 years. At the time, the amount of hours wasn't a concern, because nobody expected anything more than 1 or 2 games per week, airing on weekends, because that was the role of sports on TV in those days. But Derby was the first example of one of TV's great trends that continues to this day: find something hot, overexpose it, and burn it out way too fast. Think Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Derby was the hottest TV show on ABC for the next year, which ended up airing live games for 2 to 3 hours, 3 nights per week, in prime time, and another game on Saturday afternoon. With her experience in Europe, Anne was hooked. After the tour was over, she went to a roller derby training school in Salt Lake City, and was picked up quickly. She also had a unique skating style with a different type of arm movements and stride that made her stand out. For most of her life, in any social situation, no matter who was there, including celebrities, when Anne was at a function, she was always the center of attention. She both looked and talked the part. While the Derby poster sold sex, drawings of blonde women in tight shorts and tops were on the programs and posters, and always noted that unlike her first company, roller derby didn't want you if you couldn't skate the game. The actual uniforms used in games were bulky, more like hockey uniforms, but in publicity photos, the women posed in form-fitting tops and tight shorts. And always talked about her breasts, using the term tickets, because she believed that's what caused men to buy tickets. Later in life, when she was the captain of her various teams, or even in media appearances posing with other women, as they were posing, Anne would bark, "Tickets out, girls, stomachs in." Ann was picked up in 1949 and was a star on ABC television within 3 months. By Christmas there was already an Ann Calvello fan club. She was by no means the biggest star of the women, as Murray and Tuffy were the big two during the entire ABC run. Realistically, she was probably between the 6th and 8th biggest star. In the first year of roller derby doing national awards, in 1950, she was named to the All-Star team, so she was voted by her fellow skaters as one of the best 8. She placed 10th in fan voting for the All-American team, most popular, basically a fan vote at the arenas similar to what baseball did, and still does today, with its All-Star game, and was among the top scorers, usually skating with the Philadelphia Panthers, who actually skated home games in Philadelphia. Perhaps the height of the roller derby's popularity was 1950. Tuffy doing an early version of the ground and pound on Murray was the full cover of the May 27, 1950 issue of TV Guide, with a feature story on the upcoming World Series of the Roller Derby, held on several straight nights in Madison Square Garden playing to packed houses. But even though he was making money hand over fist, Leo Seltzer started getting worried about the monster called television. He wanted to end the 1949 season after the successful championship playoffs, which would seem to make sense. ABC thought differently. The network needed Derby, or its primetime schedule would collapse, and the network wasn't thinking long-term. The idea of reruns hadn't come about in television, and for 2 years, Derby aired 4 games per week, 52 weeks a year, on network television, much to the chagrin of its owner, who didn't realize his broadcast partners would be so short-sighted. Seltzer and ABC were at odds when the contract expired in early 1951, because all that free television was hurting the live gates, and he saw the handwriting on the wall. The story of Derby in many ways was the first example of many aspects of television. The truth is its success did not prove so much the power of the game, as much as the power of television. Indeed, one could argue the first example of the new power of television in society was the night of the first game, when Leo's number was given during the telecast for ticket reservations for the rest of the run, and he and his wife were up until 3 a.m. processing orders. A major company wanted to sponsor games after the ABC deal expired, and Leo wanted only 1 game a week on television, but the sponsor had a problem with being turned down by another sport, suddenly hated television, and pulled out. Quite frankly, if Derby was as hot at that point as it was a year earlier, that wouldn't have mattered. CBS and NBC weren't interested, because as Leo expected, interest had fallen in the last few months due to overexposure. Gene Gammon, a husband of Jerry Murray and arguably the best male skater of the time, referred to that period as, "Every day was Christmas." Even without television, they continued strong for a while in the Northeast, and even set records when the 1951 World Series of Roller Derby that summer drew 82,000 fans over 5 straight nights at Madison Square Garden just through the power of newspaper advertising and coverage, with the Chiefs winning the championship. "A lot of people didn't understand Annie, and not everybody liked her," said Murray, now 81, in the book Roller Derby to Roller Jam. "She was always outspoken and said what was on her heart." Ann remained one of the top jammers and made the All-Star team again that season and the next season. But soon after Derby lost TV, Ann's life was changing. She became tight with referee Roy Langley, which has its irony since Ann gave referees hell most of her career. She was known as the queen of the penalty box, billed, and it was almost surely true, as holding the all-time record for penalty minutes for anyone in any sport. They were married on August 23, 1952, and both quit the roller derby to move back to San Francisco. Her daughter, Teresa Ann Langley, known as Terry, was born on August 11, 1953. Ann always felt a closeness to Hulk Hogan, and when she first met him in the 80s backstage at WWF Superstars taping at the Cow Palace, her opening line to him was how both he and her daughter were born on the same day, and both had the same first name. Roy Langley was an alcoholic and an abusive husband, a fact that was largely kept secret even to Calvello's friends. While Calvello openly would tell everyone the story of her life, her marriage was a closed subject other than it didn't work, as it clearly left scars. Most had generally assumed she was the heel, deciding to go back skating and abandoned her young daughter to be a star, who was raised by her father and her grandparents. The two were actually quite close after Derby closed, as Terry often went to Derby games, parties and reunions with her mother, but their relationship was almost more like a domineering big sister. When Ann would talk about her in her years on the road, she would brag about how beautiful her daughter was, and note that she grew up as Terry Langley, and didn't have to grow up in school in the Bay Area with the last name Calvello, and that people didn't know who her mother was, so she didn't have to deal with that pressure. In Demon of the Derby, her daughter did make it clear how hard it was and how much she missed out by not having a mother most of the time growing up. It wasn't until a neighbor of hers from that era in Demon of the Derby talked about their fights and explained what she had heard with her own ears that Ann had to put up with, that it ever came out, shocking even Derby insiders who thought they knew her life, since it was largely an open book. The Derby moved its operations from New York to Los Angeles after it ran out of steam losing television. In 1954, Leo created what ended up being the most famous team ever in the U.S. They were first called the California Bombers, but around 1956, were renamed the San Francisco Bay Bombers. Ann was on the original team in 1954, as the number 2 female star behind Annis Big Red Jensen. The Bombers at first were mainly a red shirt team, playing against the Los Angeles Braves. While most of the skaters hung around each other, Ann was wild, dressing outrageously for her time, and hung with many movie star types in Hollywood like Bob Hope, Harpo Marx, Robert Wagner, and she was regularly seen in the company of 50s actor Troy Donahue. Jerry Seltzer noted on TV after her death that men loved Ann, but wouldn't take it any farther. Charlie, a New York kid who grew up skating on sidewalks, whose grandmother told him to try out for Derby, and the most promising young skater in the league, was sent to San Francisco when the Bombers started. The two had a torrid affair that lasted 6 years, starting when Charlie was 20 and Ann was 26. As the story goes, Ann stole Charlie from Loretta Little Iodine Barons, another skater, starting a feud between the two that was legendary behind the scenes. But Ann and Barons had gotten close in recent years. Ann and I were very good friends when I first came into roller derby, Barons wrote the day of Ann's death. I treasure every moment that we had together, along with our other friends. Of course, through the years there were words. What friends don't have disagreements? When I look at this picture of the two of us together at the San Jose Civic Auditorium a year ago October, I get a lump in my throat. People can say what they wish to say about our friendship, but I know that this night all hatchets were buried. I will miss her very much, but I know that she is in a better place now. Charlie and Ann both wore number 40, which meant they paired together during pre-game warm-ups. Ann already had her own style. Her uniform had a low plunging neckline and a zipper, which sometimes caused rivals who were mad at her for her aggressive play or her outspoken personality to retaliate by grabbing the zipper and painfully jamming it into her tickets. She rolled the sleeves up on her uniform, revealing muscular arms. She never lifted weights, but she would lay in the sun all day so she had the tan. Sometimes did rowing. But it was more her freaky genes. Plus skating every night kept her toned. If she was 30 today and people saw her on the street, they would immediately think she lives in a tanning bed, goes to the gym every day, eats carefully, got a boob job, and takes low doses of steroids. The Bombers skated at the Cow Palace, but 1,200 fans was considered a good night. It was going nowhere. Leo's son Jerry had just gotten out of Northwestern University, and before getting a job, showed up and did some trackside announcing and scorekeeping. His father was just about to shut the entire operation down, after a last-ditch effort to save it by the 1958 attempt in New York, where they did an entire season of legitimate games. It was the only time in Derby's history such a thing happened. Leo had come to the conclusion that it was the lack of legitimacy that had killed his product. But it didn't pan out, although the rookies that came out of that New York season ended up being some of the greats that carried the game in the 60s, including Buddy Atkinson Jr., whose mother, Bobby Johnston Atkinson, was Ann's captain on the Panthers when she started, and whose father trained almost all the Derby stars. And he later married a skater, his daughter briefly skated, and his son was the top male star in Roller Jam, Mike Gammon, the son of Jerry Murray and stepson of Gene Gammon, who learned to skate at 18 months and ended up a prodigy of the sport as the most gifted jammer in its history. Judy McGuire and Ronnie Robinson. The son decided to give it a try. Jerry never saw roller derby as anything lasting, but he enjoyed promoting. What saved the game was Jerry getting the Bombers on KTVU, CH2, an Oakland-based station, in 1958, which was just starting up and had little programming that was drawing any viewers at the time. The station would grow, with the Bombers, to be the strongest independent TV station on the West Coast, and always talked about her romance with Charlie. The first time I interviewed her for a long story, some 20 years after they had broken up and she was already in her 50s, she brought up out of nowhere, I used to date Charlie O'Connell, as if it was a bigger deal than the celebrities and other sports stars she'd been with. People who knew both couldn't fathom the relationship working, at least from a personality standpoint. Both were their own people who wanted to do what they wanted and were totally domineering over their own lives. Ann was as outgoing as they came and made everyone she came in contact with immediately feel like a longtime friend. Charlie had his inner circle of a few friends and didn't want to deal with anyone else. They had nothing in common, other than they were both stars on the Bombers, and their fights and breakup were legendary. At her death, the story of Ann going heel which was the greatest move of her career, told by most, including Jerry Seltzer, was that she hated being a white shirt and demanded to be switched. Fitzpatrick, a former skater and close friend, said that the real story was that after the nasty breakup, both Charlie and Ann went to Seltzer, both demanding the other goes. Seltzer naturally went with Charlie, who was by then already the best player in the league. Ann went to the Brooklyn Red Devils, and started really developing her heel style. There are many different versions of the story as to where the different color hair came from. By the 80s, she was known by most people in the area as that roller derby woman from the old days with green hair, although she actually wore it in many different colors depending on her mood and what team she was skating with. Probably the most accurate story is that all the women were dyeing their hair blonde. She'd done that as well, and she simply wanted to be different and stand out. While derby lore has that she was in her glory playing heel, Fitzpatrick said she told him differently. In 1961, when both the New York and Los Angeles circuits were shut down because they weren't drawing, and San Francisco was doing great, it became a Northern California league. That meant the red shirt teams didn't get much work. The Bombers would alternate skating 3 or 4 different red shirt teams for generally 2 weeks at a time, skating 5 nights a week in different cities, playing the Cow Palace every Saturday night, Kezar Pavilion for TV every Sunday, San Jose every Monday, and other cities within driving distance on Thursdays and Fridays. While the Cow Palace drew the biggest crowds, and by this point the biggest games like the midseason and final championship playoffs sold out and turned people away, San Jose was the other hotbed, skating most of the time outdoors at the local baseball stadium. The Bombers were the city's hottest sports attraction. But that meant Ann was only working about 2 out of every 8 weeks, and they only skated April through the end of September. She was actually a bigger star than ever because the Derby had gotten so big on local television, but worked as a cocktail waitress much of the year. Still, that year, something major happened. One of the Derby sponsors opened a car dealership in Eugene, Oregon, and to get publicity, wanted to sponsor Derby tapes on a local station. The product was really hitting its stride behind Charlie, and they started getting an unusual amount of fan mail from Eugene. In passing, announcer Walt Harris mentioned a letter, and without being told, brought up offhandedly that maybe you fans in Eugene would like to see a live game. Well, was it? Letters poured into Bomber headquarters. On a Thursday night, they loaded up 2 teams on an airplane and went up to Eugene, and they sold out and turned people away. Jerry figured if it would work in Eugene, it would probably work everywhere, and started building a nationally syndicated TV network. The method worked so well that by 1963, they had TV in much of the country and did the first winter tour. He provided the tapes for free in exchange for 2 minutes of advertising time. The idea would be to do something just like wrestling. They would schedule a game in the market, and then for 2 months before, the top skaters on the 2 teams would do customized interviews about the game in the market. It was a killer formula for everyone. The stations, particularly the newer UHF stations that were springing up and garnering almost no audience in markets, got an hour of programming that usually did big ratings and often allowed them to beat their network opposition. And Derby wasn't just on weak stations, as it aired in numerous markets on network affiliates. The tapes were bicycled around the country. There were maybe only a few masters of each show. Stations would get a tape, and then be sent the postage to mail the tape onto another station. Many stations got the tapes a couple of months after the games were actually played. Then final station on the cycle would send the tape back to KTVU, and it would be taped over. Very little original Derby footage remains. When Ann died and local stations were looking for footage, the only stuff they could find of her glory days were clips of her from the movie Derby. Believe it or not, there is some footage from the ABC games in the 50s, and clips shown over and over were, sadly, her, in her late 60s, in her last games. Very quickly, it was the winter games on tour that were where most of the money was made, and Jerry became rich. Even those in the Bay Area who had no use for roller derby admitted Jerry himself was a great promoter. Besides television, the Derby used a simple but effective promotional system. During every game, Harris would tell fans if they sent in a self-addressed stamped envelope, they could get a free copy of the roller derby rules. At live events, fans were encouraged to leave their name and address before they left the building so they could be put on the roller derby mailing list or be sent in the mail a free copy of the rules. Jerry didn't make his road schedule based on TV ratings, which he never trusted, but he felt volume of mail coming from a market was a much more accurate tool to determine where games would draw. A couple of months before a game in their market, everyone who had signed up would be sent a letter letting them have the first shot at tickets to the one game per year in their area. When Jerry and a promoter in Mexico made a deal to start up the Mexico City Cardenales, she went there as the top woman babyface star. They did very well at first, But it didn't sustain itself. She was 34 years old and fed up with working part-time. She was at the athletic peak of her career. She was the leading women's scorer for the season, despite being primarily a blocker, and for the first time, after her 8th career appearance on the All-Star team, the skaters voted her the 1963 Most Valuable Player Award, the only year she would ever win such an honor. She retired the next day and moved with a boyfriend to Hawaii, where she could lie at the beach or row the canoe in the ocean all day year-round, and find a job at a club working at night. Ironically, her career was just beginning. After roller derby left Los Angeles in 1961, many of the skaters didn't want to move to San Francisco, the only place where games were being held on a full schedule and the last surviving hotbed. The skaters tried to promote on their own, and, being skaters, quickly failed. Bill Griffiths, who was the advertising executive for Maywood Belford, which sponsored the Braves Derby games, got a TV deal with KTLA in Los Angeles for the New Skaters League. That was the station that also carried wrestling, and got Dick Lane, the legendary wrestling announcer, to broadcast. That wasn't unusual, because in San Francisco, Harris, the Derby announcer, also broadcast Roy Shire's wrestling. With the skaters' operation about to collapse, KTLA told Griffiths that he promised them 2 hours of weekly product and his name would be mud in the town if he didn't deliver. All of a sudden, he pulled things together and ended up as the boss of the league. The Seltzers owned the roller derby name, so Griffiths called his Operation Roller Games, and his white shirt team was called the Los Angeles Thunderbirds, named actually as a tie-in with Thunderbird, the new hip car, in the Ford line. Like the car, which was immortalized in a Beach Boys song, the team also became better known years later as the T-Birds. To the unaided eye, they were largely the same, except roller games had higher scores, and in derby, everyone wore a helmet, and in games, only the two jammers did. But to the skaters, they were altogether different. Roller derby was the glory days of New Japan Pro Wrestling. Roller games was the glory days of WWE. They drew different fans, most of whom loved one product and didn't like the other. Derby drew more of a sports audience, while the Wilder games drew a strong minority audience. To this day, fans will argue vehemently about which was better, usually siding with the one they grew up with. There was a tremendous rivalry of the skaters themselves. At times, the two leagues were at odds and they competing with each other like an ugly pro wrestling local promotional war. Other times they observed an unwritten rule to stay out of each other's territory, and even at times traded red shirt teams to freshen things up. There were even all-star games and interpromotional games which at times turned nasty with a high injury rate. Joni even injured her high school best friend, Tony Tagg, who stayed in Los Angeles and became a star with the roller games. In another game when the roller games all-stars were skating derby style, Shirley Hardman suffered a broken back that ended her career as a full-time skater and led to her becoming the first female infield coach in history. Perhaps the most famous incident was when Leroy Gonzalez of roller games was in an interleague game at Keyser Pavilion in San Francisco on live television, and purposely broke Charlie's nose in a fight. He was immediately thrown out of the game. Knowing there would be a likely rematch in the dressing room, Gonzalez snuck out of the building before the game was over, but not before leaving a note in the dressing room for him reading, "The King is dead. Long live the Queen." For a long time, that was the behind-the-scenes battle cry of the game's skaters, a strong number of whom were gay. That was the case in derby as well. The Bombers had skated the T-Birds roller games style in Los Angeles, but Charlie didn't skate as he briefly retired to become an infield coach. To repay the favor, when the T-Birds were brought up to San Francisco to skate the Bombers roller derby style for the first game ever at the Oakland Coliseum Arena in 1967, the word got out that Charlie was looking for revenge. The T-Birds men's skaters were scared to death before the game started. In fact, Danny Riley, the team's powerhouse blocker and enforcer, was afraid to skate the game and never left the dressing room. The derby skaters always considered themselves superior because their game looked more realistic, and they were trained to shoot first and entertain second. It was a slower, harder-hitting, more defensive-oriented game. The more offensive game style encouraged a faster and more showboating style, particularly from the jammers, and it was a game with more of a reliance on speed. The game's skaters, particularly in later years, would admit the derby skaters' superiority in the blocking aspect, but would claim their overall superiority, when they skated against each other, was not all it was cracked up to be by the derby skaters. They claimed their faster-paced game evolved whereas the skating skill level within derby stagnated with the frowning upon the outrageous. The roller derby training school in Alameda, taught by Buddy Atkinson Sr. and wife Bobby Johnson Atkinson, taught skaters first how to skate on a banked track, then how to block and fall, and then put them in games at the center, and Rookie League games 1 or 2 nights a week at 7 p.m. before the Bombers game started. The training center games and Rookie League games were a complete shoot. When someone was good enough to be picked up, only then were they told about cooperation and the signature plays. The idea was that every roller derby trained star was trained to shoot and could go for real, but they entertained in the games because they were there to please the crowd. The game itself was fast and hard-hitting, and, at least as compared to other forms, realistic. The referees were instructed to call the game as a shoot. A heel like Ann had to watch the refs when she would hit skaters from behind with her helmet, or sucker punch them, because if they saw, she was in the penalty box. Sometimes they saw and sometimes they didn't, and she got better at it as the years went by. If she got 8 minutes in penalties, like a basketball player, she fouled out. They called it kicked out of the game. It was a game within a game for her, because in the Joni vs. Ann glory days, the entire game built to a crescendo and Annie couldn't get kicked out until the end of the 7th period. The referees were never told to protect her when she came close to fouling out early, so if she got wild and careless early, she had to spend time later in the game on her best behavior. Ann's style was to cheap shot the smaller Bomber girls. Her favorite victim was a 4'11", 95-pound crowd favorite named Carol Peanuts Meyer. When Joni, the enforcer, turned around, Ann backed off and skated away, even calling the refs to intercede. She'd cheap shot Joni routinely as well, usually from behind. Usually there would be a spot early where they both jammed together, and Ann would watch for the ref's blind spot, and grab Joni's jersey from behind and send her into the rail. This would lead to Ann coming around and Joni would be waiting there to block and pummel her until the end of the jam, with the biggest shot saved for last as Ann would take her patented slow bump, where she'd be on one skate and lean backwards, seemingly forever, before finally going down, usually timed right at the buzzer ending the 60 seconds jam time, for the maximum pop. But she'd bop Joni with her helmet, punch her when she wasn't looking, cheap shot her with an elbow to the ribs between plays, and run, until the 7th period blowout. At that point, they gave the crowd what they had waited all night for. Joni finally had enough with the clock running down in the last women's period, and went to start the fight. Like a rat cornered, Ann wouldn't back down. They'd trade punches, Joni would get the better blows in, and Ann would take a big bump sell, and sitting on her butt, throw a facial temper tantrum. Penalties like crazy would be called, and the men would have to skate the first jam short-handed, usually on both teams, as the guys had to serve out the penalty time incurred by the women. The girls' role was to keep the game close, and games almost always ended on the last jam skated by the men who, unless it was a rare overtime game, always decided the outcome. For realism, the Bombers usually won 55 to 65% of their games. It was a weird mentality, as if the Bombers always winning, or even winning too high a percentage, would make it fake. But every single game always coming down to the last play wouldn't be a tip-off.